Chapter 2, 1100 Charter Street. You are standing in front of the old Ursuline convent, which features some of the oldest buildings in the French Quarter. Unlike the St. Louis Cathedral, the main buildings of the convent never burned during the citywide fires of the late 1700s. From their earliest days, the Ursuline nuns served this community in various capacities, often caring for the sick and wounded during the many wars that have touched our fair city. And yes, even vampires have played a role in their history. There have been, for instance, many stories about the casket girls. In truth, many false rumors and accusations. Some claim that the nuns requested them for support. Some say they were sent to teach the wayward children of the city, a job that had proven to be too big for Mother Superior Marie Tranchepin and the 7 Ursulines that already inhabited the convent. And some say they came because of an advertisement placed in Paris for young ladies to venture abroad and find husbands. But I know the truth, as I was there to witness it. The year was 1727. I was living in a small cottage about 5 blocks from here. New Orleans was mostly full of brigands and prostitutes. Nevertheless, believing that the city was sacred, Pope Benedict XIII ordered 12 of the Ursulines to travel from France to New Orleans. Of course, these were no ordinary women. They were 12 of the holiest and most devout nuns. And when they arrived, each towing what appeared to be a casket, they explained that the coffins were simply their traveling containers. Not surprisingly, this earned them a nickname, the Casket Girls. As I have said, the French Quarter was then filled with many of the worst sort. Frankly, it eased my conscience to feed off the rotten and the despicable. Though in truth, I only fed a little, never killing anyone. The Pope, however, had a different plan, for in the 12 coffins lay 12 vampires who had agreed to do his bidding after being spared by the vampire hunters who had caught them. In exchange for their safe passage across the sea, these vampires were charged with the task of eliminating all of the undesirables in the city. 1 week after the vampires arrived, the Ursulines released the first one from his coffin and into the night. The nuns, of course, were wise enough to allow only 1 vampire out every night. Beyond the chaos that 12 vampires would cause, it would be far too dangerous, and too difficult, for the nuns to force all of them back into their prisons simultaneously. The coffins were sealed with special nails that the Pope had blessed, and that the vampires had sworn on, binding their oath within the iron, making it impossible for them to break out. Whenever the vampires were released, they would visit all of the local places of debauchery, snagging thieves, prostitutes, and murderers on whom they could feed. Luring these lowlifes into seclusion, the vampires would strike, draining the very life from them. Every night after feeding, the chosen vampire would return to the convent, where one of the nuns would be waiting to lock him inside his coffin. On occasion, I would encounter one of these vampires as I made my rounds throughout the quarter, though we never acknowledged each other beyond a raised brow or a simple nod. You see, one of the abilities that we all possess is knowing each other. Or rather, knowing who is and who is not a vampire. At the time, even though I wasn't killing my prey, I felt no ill will toward these vampires. After all, they were paying quite a steep price for the safe passage they'd received. Though allowed to feed regularly, they spent much of their time locked inside their coffins, at the mercy of the nuns to release them again. I would have found such an existence maddening. Nevertheless, this agreement went on for almost 7 years, though in reality it did little to counter the bad element, especially as the city continued to grow. Which is why it came as no surprise that by the time the nuns had moved the coffins into the newly constructed building in 1734, the vampires had decided that they'd fully paid their penance to both the Pope and the Ursulines. So after returning from his sanctioned night of feeding, an especially nasty vampire named Baltar informed the nun on duty that he would not return to his coffin, but instead intended on leaving. Unfortunately, that particular night shift had fallen to the youngest of the Ursulines, who foolishly tried to shame Baltar back into his coffin. Sadly, it only took a few moments for him to drain the life from her, And by the time the other nuns had arrived, wondering why their sister had not come down from the 3rd floor, it was already too late. Baltar had opened the 11 remaining coffins, freeing his fellow vampires. Luckily, the nuns were carrying torches at the time, or else the vampires would have simply killed all of them. Instead, the nuns forced the vampires to leap out of the windows, falling 3 stories to the ground below, but certainly not to their deaths. Baltar and the other vampires vowed that they would seek revenge. So to protect themselves and everyone else in the convent, the nuns used the holy nails from the coffins to seal the 3rd floor windows, then pounded 1 nail in each window and door jamb throughout the building. Fortunately for the nuns, this had the desired effect, preventing Baltar and the others from entering. It didn't entirely deter Baltar, however, as he would occasionally leave his night's kill on the convent grounds, forcing the sisters to clean up the mess. Soon afterward, the vampires scattered throughout the land, mainly to avoid the wrath of Pope Benedict's vampire hunters. But despite their disappearing act, victims are still found on the convent's grounds, at least once a decade. Following the debacle at the old Ursuline convent, the Catholic Church ceased making deals with the vampires that they captured. Instead, they either burned them to death or beheaded them. Sometimes a bit of both. But the Church wasn't the only organization to utilize vampires. If you turn around and head across Charters to the famous Beauregard Kai's house, I can tell you about the beginnings of the American Mafia, and how vampires are also part of that story. Pause the audio until you're ready for Chapter 3.